back. This is the Word for the Valley podcast, and we are listening to sermons from Pastor Mike's in-depth teaching through the book of Matthew. And in this section, Jesus addresses the scribes and the Pharisees' interpretation of God's command to not commit adultery. And Jesus says that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Again, Jesus' focus is where these sins actually begin, stating that adultery starts in the heart. Let's listen in with Pastor Mike as he picks up in chapter 5, verse 27.
Now we come here to verse 27, and he moves into the arena or the topic of adultery. It's nothing like starting out with the biggies right from the beginning here in these kinds of things, right? Murder and adultery, the two capital crimes of the nation of Israel, that if you committed these things in Israel, they would take you out in the town square and stone you to death. I mean, these are the biggies, murder here and adultery. Now we move into adultery, marriage, and the keeping of oaths here in this section. Now, let me make one kind of a rejoinder, one statement from the beginning in this, because I know what kind of hot button stuff this all produces. Let me just make this statement, okay? From Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 25, it says this: "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed.'" That's Genesis 2, verses 21 through 25. Before the fall, in the Garden of Eden, God created marriage. He created man and woman, and then he created marriage. Here's the thing that so many of us in our culture seem to have forgotten: that God is the one who defines marriage and not man. God is the one who defines how this works. He's the one who created it. He knows the best intent of it. He knows the purpose of it. He knows what's right and wrong in it. He affirms Genesis 2 in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus himself saying, this is God's order, this is God's purpose, this is God's will regarding marriage. It hasn't changed from the Old Testament to the New. It was actually a pre-fall condition. Imagine that honeymoon between Adam and Eve, right? No punching a time clock to get back to work, no working with insurance companies, no, you don't even have to sign a certificate and send it into the government to say that you're married. No wedding services, no in-laws. I mean, what kind of heaven is that marriage, kind of thing? What a wonderful thing, in all of that. No sin, where the man and his wife could be together with complete openness, and nobody on the planet was ashamed of it. That is God's intention in marriage. One man, one woman, for life. I don't care what the United States of America legalizes. We've legalized all kinds of stupid stuff. It may be legal. I'm not even going to discuss civil unions. All right? I'm not going to discuss kind of open-ended free divorce. Whatever the government wants to do, that's their problem. I'm talking to Christians. I'm talking to people who care about getting to heaven when they die. That is my concern. And in light of that, we are going to hold to this: marriage, one man, one woman, for life, with a vow at the beginning, right? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, step 1, be joined to his wife, right? Step 2, and then the two shall be one flesh. The one flesh is the sex that comes after being joined. The joined is the agreement that our lives are going to be committed to one another till somebody dies. That's the vow. So don't tell me we went out into the woods and we said a prayer and then we slept together, right? You didn't make a vow, a binding commitment for the rest of your life with one another. Joe Foch always says, "You're married when I say you are." Don't all this goofy stuff that people do. We're married in God's eyes. No, in God's eyes, you're sinning. And frankly, every time you sin, he sees it. And there's no pleasure in that for him at all. And you're deceiving yourself, right? So, laying all that out from the start. If you have any problems with that, please tell Pete or somebody else. So, verse 27. I'm kidding. Talk to me. Let me say this too. I love intellectual, thought-through discussions, even when you completely disagree with me. I actually appreciate it when people are sincerely discussing and thinking through stuff. What I despise is somebody who thinks they have a position, develops an argument, and they don't themselves even know what they believe or why they believe it. That is probably 3/4, 80% of the people in this world. It's not Calvary, out there, right? We don't even know what we believe or why we believe it. Where does it come from? Who made that decision? Why do we stand on that? Where did that even originate? These kinds of things, we don't even know. For us as Christians, we know right where it originates. It came from God in His Word. This is a foundation on which we can stand. And it's not up to us, thank God, because we're watching how humans destroy this planet because we have no idea what in the world we're talking about, right? But God knows. If we would do it His way, we'd have a much greater chance of success. So, verse 27. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. The biblical definition of adultery is a sexual relationship with anyone you're not married to. Okay? Sexual relationship with anybody you're not married to. The Jews of Jesus' day define this down even further, where they said adultery was only a sexual relationship between a married Jewish man and a married Jewish woman. Obviously giving themselves loopholes for other forms of sexual expression, okay? It's not biblical, but it's how they practiced it in that day typically. A little bit more probably like the United States than we would like to admit. A lot of extramarital relationships, they would hold mistresses at times. Premarital sex oftentimes would be overlooked. These kinds of things were practiced in this day as well. But the law says, you shall not commit adultery, and that stands. Now, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust, literally with desire, okay? The prohibition here is not looking. Otherwise, we're all going to walk around this bump around. You're not going to be able to drive home if you don't look. You need to keep your eyes open to function, right? The prohibition here is the lust. It's the desire that's generated by the second look and by what happens in our heart when we give place to this type of kind of a freedom of our flesh to go in this particular direction. So he says that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, the her and the he and the whoever and these kinds of, this is a man looking at a woman looking at a man now looking at a man, a woman looking at a woman. Any type of desire, ungodly, outside of the order of God and the parameters and direction of the Lord, anything that is not confined to the marriage relationship, where the desire and the lust is created to want that person or desire that person, he'll say here, in his heart. All kinds of stuff, right? We know that in the United States of America, the US of A, the grand old great US of A, the greatest producer of pornography on the planet, right? 3 times more adult bookstores in the United States of America than McDonald's is. And if you've been driving around a lot, you know there's lots of McDonald's, right? 3 times more adult bookstores. And we're not even talking now about what happens online. The accessibility to pornography and the freedom to lust and almost the expectation that you're going to do it. You know, confront a guy on that. Hey, why are you looking there? Why are you talking like, well, I'm a man, aren't I? Yes, and that is your problem. You're a man, still functioning in the flesh. Well, a woman has needs, doesn't she? Yes. And that's the problem. Still functioning in the flesh. But listen, we're not reduced to function as mere men and women functioning in the flesh. We don't have to live like animals. We can live like something different. A much more noble cause, a much higher calling, a much better way of living. Why do we want to keep acting like apes? Why don't we want to act like noble humans? Why do we keep reducing ourselves and making excuses for stuff? Jesus cuts to the chase. He says, listen, adultery in his eyes is here, this lustful look, this lustful desire of somebody that you're not married to. Now listen, one of the commentaries said this week, you can't lust after your spouse. Actually, you're supposed to desire your spouse. That's not lust. That's marriage, right? And in Hebrews, the marriage bed is pure and undefiled. Whatever you and she agree on, figure it out, work it out, practice it, move on, kind of thing. Just that's encouraged, condoned, and in that context, it is to be explored. Outside of that context, it's not to be touched at all. It's not to be given one little place in our lives. And he says here, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her, already, as God sees it, committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, here's one of the things I hear from time to time, and it's just, again, an example of a nonsensical conclusion to an instruction of the Lord, where people will say, well, if I've already lusted and God sees that as adultery, then I might as well just go through with it. And I think you're dumb. Now, I probably should say that in a different way, because that's probably close to Raka. I should say that's dumb. You're probably pretty smart, but that's dumb. That's better. That would fit in the category. And because you don't think that way in any other area of your life. If you're in the mall and you see a beautiful pair of shoes, I'm making up a story that I don't do. So hopefully you don't do it either. But you're walking through the mall and you see this beautiful pair of shoes. You're like, I need that pair of shoes. Need that pair of shoes. I need that pair of shoes. You've lusted after that pair of shoes. Now, that's not lust here in this context. That's covetousness. We'll get to that later. Okay? That's a different issue. All right? But you've already developed a desire for that pair of shoes. In God's eyes, he already sees it as if you've done it. The desire, the ungodly desire, not surrendered, not yielded, not sacrificed, not turned away from. God already sees in your heart as if you have already committed the crime. Right? So if in your mind you think, well, if God already sees it as if I committed the crime, I might as well just go take those pair of shoes and stuff them in my pocket and see if I can get out of here with a new pair of shoes that I can't certainly afford. Right? Again, dumb, because now you've just increased the consequences. Right? If you deal with this in your thought life, you and the Lord can process through this without any external consequences. If you take those shoes and you steal them, now the police are involved and you're going to do time. The same is true with adultery. If we deal with lust and this kind of thing early on, and listen, none of us goes without this. In the same way that none of us doesn't deal with anger. None of us goes without having to deal with lust. But deal with it in your thought life. Deal with it early. Deal with it as soon as you know that there's conviction that it's wrong. Deal with it. The more place you give to it in your life, the more time to look, the more, well, I'll only be on the internet 30 minutes tonight. Oh, now I'm only on the internet 45 minutes. Now I'm only on the... You see these guys like nights away, kind of clicking around and looking at all kinds of stuff. Soon somebody's going to find out. Probably your internet service provider already knows, right? And if you click on the wrong site, there will be people coming to your house and you will be child pornography merely because it went through your IP address. And everything will come out. Then you make it real life and you find a woman, you kind of do this kind of thing, and then you move on to an adulterous relationship with a woman. The consequences are only going to increase the further you give place to this in your life. From God's standard, the crime's already been committed, but deal with it there in your heart, which is what he goes on to say next. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable, look, it is more profitable, it's better for you that one of your members perish, just your little old eye. It's better that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Now, for those of us who've been in and around the church a little while, we can read these verses and, oh, that's interesting, right? But listen, stop and think. You, alone in your house, and you have a fork. For some odd reason, no, don't do this. This is a hypothetical picture. For some odd reason, you think, I just need to get rid of my right eye. It's been bugging me, right? Because this is what guys do, right? But I got eyes, don't I? Well, Jesus says, well, let's take care of that. right? You at home and a fork, and you stab your eye out. It is to produce that type of response. It should make you feel bad. That's exactly the response we should all go, ugh. That's what he wants us to respond to. This is hyperbole. He's going over the top to make us feel a particular way about this sin. And then he says in verse 30, and if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you, because there's no reason to put that in your pocket, right? Cut it off, cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And I remember the time Joe Foch told of a friend in California who was reading this passage and went out into his garage and cut his hand off with a bandsaw. Again, you hear that? Did you hear that? Oh my. I don't know who said it. I won't point anybody out. Right? Oh my. Oh wow. Ooh, a little excessive, isn't it? That's exactly what Jesus wants you to think about that. Because that is how despicable this sin of lust and desire is in the eyes of the Lord. As if a person would gouge out their eye with a fork or cut their hand off with a bandsaw. Now, the remarkable thing as you play this out, kind of working through this, is this. If you gouge your eye out with a fork, cut your hand off with a bandsaw, it's not going to stop the lust problem. Because lust doesn't originate in the eyes, and it doesn't conclude in the hands. Right? It actually starts in the heart. You talk to a guy and he thinks that somehow or another he's going to wait it out. I'm just going to kind of wait this out, and someday I'm going to get to be too old to sin. Kind of one of the desires of men sometimes. I just wish I could turn this thing off, and I wish the desire would go away, and I wish I wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. I just wish someday I'll just get to be too old to sin. And you realize that David committed sin with Bathsheba. He was probably 50 plus years old at that time, and then you get a little bit discouraged. That the greatest sin in this arena in David's life happened not as a young man, but as an old man. And probably because he didn't deal with the root issues in his heart when he was young, that these things grew and grew and grew, and then he gave place to it, and then it ended up destroying his family. Destroyed his family. People oftentimes talk about the forgiveness that God offered David. God offered David unilateral forgiveness from sins. But what people oftentimes don't talk about is the consequences that David dealt with for the remainder of his life that never went away all the way up to his death. He had to abdicate the throne in his old age and cede it to Solomon because Adonijah took it upon himself to become the next king. David wasn't even able to keep himself warm. He needed a human hot water bottle. They hired a young lady to keep him warm. She would tuck herself in there next to him at night to keep his body warm. He couldn't even keep himself warm, and he has to deal with that at the end of his life because of his sin with Bathsheba. There is forgiveness, and there is restoration, but there are also consequences. And they in some ways go together. And here, the Lord is saying, if you think that it's merely your eye or merely your hand, then take care of that. If that's all it takes, then take care of it. But then what you'll find is it's actually a heart issue. And you can't take care of that, but I can. You can't fix that. Right? In the same way that we can't fix the anger issue inside our own hearts. It just comes. Right? But the Lord says, I can deal with that. If you surrender it back to me, you give it to me, you walk in me. I can help you through that. Doesn't mean your nature's not going to be there, but I have a way through that. It's a hard thing. Now, furthermore, it has been said in verse 31, you'd wish that it would just, could we just talk about puppies? I want to see a cat video right now. For some reason, I'm just all stressed out, right? Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give a certificate of divorce. And this is from Deuteronomy chapter 24, where it was actually made a provision in the law for divorce. Now, Jesus will say in Matthew chapter 19, that was never God's intention from the beginning. He didn't want that, but he made the exception, right? The rule of thumb is this. God will oftentimes allow even things that aren't the best. There's a lot of people trying to figure out what God requires. Knock it off. Don't live in just what God requires. Live in what God desires, right? And then you won't have to worry about what God requires. So many Christians trying to figure out where the line is. How many drinks can I have before I'm legally, officially in God's eyes, drunk? That's a nonsensical thought process. If you think that way, you're off. You're wrong, right? What does God desire? God desires, again, one man and one woman until there's a funeral. That's his desire. Or the rapture, which is, I prefer that option, all right? One man, one woman for life. So he made the provision in Deuteronomy 24. Again, had gotten taken way out of proportion and used well beyond measure because there was an exclusive clause. There was a kind of an out clause in Deuteronomy 24 where it says that if there was an uncleanness in the spouse, then it would cause divorce. Well, when you get men defining the word unclean and then figuring out what gives them the freedom to divorce a woman, they come up with conclusions like, if she burns my toast in the morning, she is out of here, right? She is aged out of the marriage. Right? I mean, she's so old at 33. I need a 20-year-old, right? And they're just looking for a reason. Oh, you burned the toast. Poof, gone. Kick her to the curb. Midlife crisis at 35. I'm going to marry a 20-year-old kind of thing. And just did that over and over again. Even the religious leaders of this day oftentimes had up to 10 to 15 wives through their lifetime. All very permissible, all very legal in their minds, because there was an obvious uncleanness and she deserved to be divorced. But this is not what the Lord says, right? Yeah, she says here now in verse 32, but I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality, that exception is given to us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, and in Matthew 19, verse 9. That exception is not included in Mark 10 or in Luke 16. There's a lot of debate over should there even be an exclusive clause for a divorce within a marriage. Me, in my practice, I will permit and work with somebody whose spouse has committed fornication. Here's the context. We'll talk about that in a second. Who's committed fornication with them, and as a result, they themselves want to get married. I do believe that this is the act that breaks the covenant. Now, for the person who's been sinned against, okay, say the man has committed sexual immorality and the woman has not. The woman then has the right to forgive the sin and move on as if it had never happened. She has the freedom to do that. She also has the freedom that if she realizes she can't forgive him, she can't trust him, that she believes that he's going to just keep doing it over and over and over again, she has the right to divorce, and then she has the freedom then to then go and remarry. The sin is not on her part. We'll explain that in just a second. It gets a little bit confusing here, okay? But because he sinned, he broke the marriage covenant, she then is released from the oath. She has to make this decision. There's actually a time. Make a choice. She makes this decision, no, I'm going to get a divorce, then go ahead, get the divorce. Don't play in the middle ground, go get divorce, okay? If you're going to restore the relationship, if you're going to forgive, right, then you don't mention this past, you work through it, you get to a counselor, you deal with the root cause issues, but you don't keep bringing up past errors. This is the decision that ends up getting made. But I do believe, again, in my practice, that if there is sexual immorality within a house, within a marriage relationship, that the non-offending partner does have the decision to execute a divorce and then are free to remarry as if they had not been married before. That's what I take here because of this exception, right? If you had not included it in Matthew 5 or in Matthew 19, I wouldn't allow that exception either, right? The only reason even for a separation then would be physical abuse. And then as 1 Corinthians 7 tells us, an unbelieving spouse who doesn't and is harmful, just get a separation, just get some distance to protect the safety of the person who's being hurt, right? That's all good, okay? So verse 32, he says here now, the exception is sexual immorality. Now this is very interesting because he transitions from the more narrow word adultery to the much broader word now, fornication. Fornication includes adultery, but it's not just adultery. Adultery defined very technically, very carefully. It's actually the sexual intercourse within the relationship. That is the adulterous part of it. Now, fornication is any sexual activity outside of the context of marriage. Marriage being defined biblically, godly. Again, you can have a civil union and it still can be ungodly. Okay? Any sexual activity outside of the context of marriage. Never do I believe more harm was done to this concept in the United States of America than years ago when Bill Clinton was tiptoeing around his escapades with Monica Lewinsky. And where he said, well, it's not this, it's only this. I believe has given the impression to the vast majority of students and all during that particular time, this next generation that followed in the heels of this, license to say, well, as long as it's not intercourse, it's all permissible. And God says, no, that's fornication. That's actually treated the same in God's eyes as adultery itself, because you can't obviously commit fornication without lusting in your heart. And so it's as if you committed adultery. All right? So again, this encompasses all kinds of stuff I don't want to talk about. All kinds of very sensitive things. And it's sad. My youth group in Berwick, this is 20 years ago, had a couple kids in my youth group that were on the football team. Football in Berwick's a big deal. George Curry was still in his heyday, right? Berwick football. And they all came to me and they said, Mike, they said, there is a whole group of girls within the school. All we have to do is say yes, and it's on at any time and anywhere we can find a free space, whether on school grounds, off school grounds, wherever it may need to be. Most of the time, not intercourse, most of the time, all of the other stuff. And just freedom, as if it was acceptable. It was almost like a perk of being a football player in Berwick. And just the mindset, the thinking that that's acceptable is twisting and corrupting a whole generation. Well, it's not sex, right? It's safe sex. It's not sex, right? It's just as bad. It's doing the same thing to your heart. Doing the same thing to your heart, right? So whoever now, he says, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, let me make this explanation, right? So the woman is divorced, and she's not, except for sexual immorality. She's divorced for a reason other than sexual immorality. She is not an adulterer because she's being divorced. That's not what it says here, okay? It reads that, but it's not what it means, okay? Because the context is, whoever then marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. The reason that the woman who didn't commit sexual immorality would be considered an adulterer is if she remarried and God still sees her as married to her first husband because there's been no sexual immorality to dissolve that original union. It's in the remarriage that the adultery then is committed. Just because a moral, upstanding Christian woman is divorced by her husband, and she herself did not do anything wrong. He did not sin against her. He is not going to remarry. He is not going to start another relationship. He is going to stay pure before the Lord to the rest of her life. Then she stays pure before the Lord for the rest of her life. If she remarries, then she's in adultery. Okay? And the person who marries her is also then in adultery. Now, the Lord hates divorce. You're in that case, the kind of thing, then you make the best way through it from there. Okay? But you don't go into it knowingly.
Well, Jesus gave some startling instructions to pluck out the eye and cut off the hand as a way of getting a reaction from the people that paralleled his own attitude toward the seriousness of the sin. But even with the absence of these members, the desire to lust will still be present because the source of the sin resides within. And removing the instrument will not eliminate the struggle. All right, I hope you can join us for part 2 of this teaching. Thanks for listening to the Word for the Valley podcast. So long, everyone.